issue. As you know, every half a second, a child makes their first click online. And in fact, 1 in 3 internet users worldwide are children. And this number is only going to get higher as we are connecting the unconnected parts of the world. And now couple those figures with the fact that in every single moment, there is an estimated 750,000 predators who are looking to sexually exploit and abuse children online. And the fact that technology is rarely developed and designed with children's safety in mind, and you will begin to get a picture of the risks and threats that children face. One of the unforeseen consequences of the rise of the internet and digital technologies has been an exponential growth in online child sexual exploitation and abuse, especially through the illicit generation and sharing of child sexual abuse images and videos. But not only. The way the digital platforms are designed and the way in which they incentivize user interactions are creating multiple opportunities and risks for children and their safety that go beyond online abuse and create multiple vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And you will get to hear all about these aspects throughout the session today. My name is Maria Manojlovic, and I lead the Safe Online team at the End Violence Global Partnership. For those who don't know us yet, the Global Partnership and the Fund to End Violence Against Children were launched by the UN Secretary General in 2016 with one goal: to catalyze and support action to end all forms of violence against children by 2030 through a unique collaboration of over 450 partners and countries from all sectors. But we are also the only global entity making targeted investments to tackle online child sexual exploitation and abuse. This year, our Safe Online team and work have reached a big milestone. We have invested $50 million in programs and cutting edge technology tools in over 70 countries, so 70, focused on tackling online child sexual exploitation and abuse. What makes our job exciting is the fact that we get to support and collaborate with organizations who are doing groundbreaking work to keep children safe and protected in the digital world, some of whom are here with you today. So without further delay, let me introduce our panelists. I will not attempt to summarize their bios and achievements because that would get us to the end of the event, but you'll get to hear more about their work through their interventions. Today with us, we have Signe Arnason, who is Associate Executive Director of Canadian Centre for Child Protection. We have Emilio Puccio, who is Coordinator of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights. We have Baroness Biban Kidron, OBE, founder and the chair of Five Rights Foundation, and John Tanago, director of the Center to End Online Sexual Exploitation of Children from the International Justice Mission in the Philippines. A few words of housekeeping. As you know, the session will last 60 minutes, and we will have one round of questions to the panelists who will take 4 to 5 minutes to respond and then open the floor for questions. Please leave your questions in the Q&A window and not in the chat. So please use the Q&A window for your questions to the panelists, and we will monitor those throughout the session. And please indicate to who you want the question to be directed, or do you want us to ask the same question to all the panelists? My colleague Trang Ho Morton, who is our Safe Online Grant Portfolio Manager, will be supporting us in taking notes of the session and monitoring the Q&A chat box. Finally, feel free to tweet at us and use social media. Our Twitter handle is GP2EndViolence, and the hashtag we use is SafeOnline. And you will see them written in the chat box. Trang will be putting them there. So I will now open the session and start asking the questions to the panelists. And I am looking forward to the questions that will come from you as soon as we are done. So let's start with Signe. Signe, you have been with the Canadian Centre for Child Protection for almost 2 decades, and you have played a critical role in establishing Canada's tip line for reporting the online sexual exploitation of children. Through the dedication of your team and the groundbreaking work of Project Arachnid, which is, for those who don't know, an automated web crawler that finds online child sexual abuse material and helps remove it. You have become one of the most significant global actors fighting for the rights of the victims of online sexual abuse. Tell us a little bit more about the work with Project Arachnid, which is a groundbreaking technology, but also share with us a bit of learning along this journey. What was the enabling and disabling factors throughout this work, and what have you learned? Over to you, Signe. We need to unmute you.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Maria. Let me start by saying thank you to End Violence. Thank you to both you for coordinating this. It's a real pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished professionals. So We're really pleased to share some information about what we're doing at the Canadian Centre for Child Protection and specifically with Project Arachnid. So as you were noting, Project Arachnid is a web crawler, but it's transformed into a platform where companies can intersect with the tool as well. But basically, it goes out and it seeks known images of child sexual abuse material. And the purpose is to detect that material and send notices quickly to the providers for removal. So the initiative has been around for about 3.5 years. And we have issued 6.3 million notices to providers. We have detected 24 million suspect media. So that would be media that would have a photo DNA match in some capacity, but wouldn't be close enough for us to say for sure whether that was the exact image. So that has to be assessed by analysts. And essentially, we've crawled 125 billion images and videos. So what we're doing is looking for the needle in the haystack and trying to detect where this material sits at rest. I think what's important to note about this is, Arachnid came in conjunction with our International Survivors Survey. So we did that back in 2016. This was the first time really we had comprehensively heard from this population, a population who have been seen, tremendously seen online and exposed, but they have not been heard from. And they've not been heard from for a variety of reasons, which includes their safety is constantly at risk. And at the end of the day, while we believe certainly it's important to be detecting the new victims that are popping up online on a daily basis, we have residual material that's been left over. We have a population of children who are now adults who have basically been abandoned. So what we've done is, the offenders may have been arrested, brought to justice, but little has been done to address the fact that their series and their material becomes commonly traded online, and then the ramifications for them in their everyday living as a result of that. So one of the things certainly that we quickly learned through Project Arachnid is that, it really has not worked in children's favor. We've done a disservice to this population by treating child sexual abuse material at a jurisdictional level. So what we've all done is we've said to ourselves, okay, is this illegal? Is this what I see in the four corners of this image? Is this illegal in my jurisdiction? Well, I can tell you for certain that a Canadian, that someone in the UK, they don't care what server the information is sitting on. All they care is that they have access to the information. And as a result, what happens is some material comes down, some stays up. So we saw immediately this issue just on the illegal side. So if we go with, say, an Interpol definition, we go with the worst of the worst, prepubescent, focus on, the genital region or a sexual act, that would be the worst of the worst. Let's all agree that's coming down. We were still seeing debates around whether that should be removed or not. We also know this is not how the offenders operate online. In fact, what they do is they possess images that are a part of a continuum in relation to the entire series. So a common tactic is to take an image and pull it from, say, a video where the video in its entirety would be deemed illegal, but in a still image of the little 3-year-old standing beside the bed in her little sundress before she's about to be assaulted is pulled from that video and posted online. And that is used as a gateway into other material and other information. What we have learned and what we are taking a stance on is that we need to stop approaching the removal of this material from a criminal law perspective. We have to approach it from what is in the best interests of children and survivors. And we are talking about removal. Companies have terms of service. They are able to remove individuals' information according to those terms of service. So we have been aggressively pushing as an organization that really what's been happening online is not good enough. And it's no wonder we have an epidemic that we're facing. The other point that I would make before I probably have to wrap up my 4 or 5 minutes is that it's really essential that this issue be drawn out into the public light. We have had copious amounts of conversations, even with industry, and these have happened behind closed doors. This happening behind closed doors does us absolutely no favors. We need to be exposing what is happening. You know, there is a reason why the Cuties movie resonated with people, and it doesn't even touch what we see online in terms of the sexual abuse and harm that is occurring for children day in and day out. And I think what that demonstrates is the public really doesn't understand what's happening for children. And when you introduce a world where we decide we are putting children with adults, we are commingling them in that environment with no rules and regs, is it any wonder that we are where we are today? So Project Arachnid is an important part of this solution in reducing the trauma, the re-victimization, and providing survivors with some hope that there's a tool dedicated to detecting their material and holding industry accountable for removing it.
Thank you so much, Signe, and thank you for all the amazing work that you and your organization are doing. I think you have flagged literally 3 really important things that will be a good introduction to the intervention of Emilio, but I want to flag them first, and that's the lack of understanding of the profound impacts that CSAM circulating the internet has. Not only CSAM is illegally framed, but also the continuum of images and videos around that they have on humans, on children, and how long those effects last. The second thing is that removal cannot be driven only by the illegal definitions, by the criminal justice definitions of what illegal material is, because that is not putting the victim in the center. That is not providing victim-centered approach. And finally, the public does not understand the issues and is not aware of the issues, and we need to really bring those to light. Emilio, can I move to you and just flag a few things before I hand it over to you? Recently in European Union, there has been these issues of the interplay between these components that I just flagged are really important and how they interact. So sometimes they can endanger or support the efforts to prevent online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And namely in Europe, a piece of legislation is about to enter into force on 20th of December. And this piece of legislation will effectively render illegal the currently used tools by the tech companies to detect child sexual abuse material online. You have organized recently under the auspices of EU Parliament Child Rights Intergroup, a meeting of experts to discuss these developments and shed more light on the role that technology and the private sector play in the fight against child sexual abuse online. Can you tell us what came out of that meeting and what are the experts saying? And can we do something to ensure that we are not crippling our ability to help children stay safe online? What are the things that we can do to shed the light on this issue and make sure that the public and parliamentarians and Europe are aware of what is currently happening and the dangers of it? Over to you, Amelia.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much for having me here today with you guys with such an important and with a lot of experts in this panel. Let me start by saying that I couldn't agree more with what Signe said just before me and what you just said now before handing it over to me. So as regards this expert meeting that we convened as European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, what we wanted to do is basically to recreate, let's say, the crime scene and give the politicians a sort of a glimpse of what is really happening out there in the real world when we deal with child sexual abuse. Has already been said by Signe and by you, reinforced by you as well, unfortunately, there is not enough knowledge. I mean, of course, us in the European Parliament as legislators are more focused on the legal answer to that. But it's very important that has been already said by Signe that in fact, it's not only a legal response that we need to work on. If I have to say, this expert meeting gathered experts from the industry. So we had representative of Microsoft. It gathered as well experts from NECMEC and other law enforcement authorities, on top, of course, of key lawmakers and legislators in the European Union. And we also heard directly from a child survivor. I think we should still stress more and more and more that the reason why we're all doing this is just because, of course, we want to prevent this phenomenon from happening. And we want to give some sort of justice to the people who've been victim or who have fallen victim to these heinous crimes. And unfortunately, I have to say that in the European Parliament, but at large, in the European Union in general, we don't leave and give a lot of spaces to victims. So it was very important for us in our event to give the opportunity for the victim to speak and talk about what she has been going through. And so, because unfortunately, as has been already highlighted, the voice of the victims often is unheard. So, well, there is always room for improvement, for sure, and even more so in such a face-to-face environment as is the online world. I have to say that from this event, one of the main takeaway of this event is that unfortunately, of course, this battle, the fight against sexual abuse online, cannot be won by a single actor. It has to be a joint effort. It has to be a whole society, multi-stakeholder approach. I will not go into much details about the figures. You have said and shared with us the terrible and staggering figures about the consistent increase in child sexual abuse online that we have been witnessing over the last year. And also, I think what was very important as well in this expert meeting that we gathered is as well to give voice to those very frontline professionals who are working out there hands-on, and especially in the case of the law enforcement authority, who are actually confronted with an enormous amount of images online. And that was very important to listen and hear from them that, again, this cooperation that they've been enjoying with the private sector, with companies, it has been proven essential for them. If actually, paradoxically, I also have to say that in a way, the global pandemic that we are now all living in and all the lockdown measures that have ensued to actually contain the further spread of the virus have somehow, in a way, helped us understand what are the risks online, what are the risks that the online world posed. And in a way, they have somehow, since the situation has been further exacerbated, they have somehow also motivated. It was a sort of a wake-up call for the politicians in the European Parliament to actually do more and try to have a global and legislative response to what is happening now. To be honest, it has always been clear to me, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer and I work with the legislators, and I've been working in the European Parliament for over 5 years, that legislation alone will not be the only answer. Legislation is just one part of the solution. I've also been a firm believer of business for good, and I do hold that businesses are actually much better placed to invest in technological solutions to help the fight against child sexual abuse. And I feel like that, in fact, with great powers always come great responsibilities. And I will say that, you know, online service provider together with every actor in society has to do their part in this fight. And the online services provider have to make sure that their networks are not used by sexual predators. Now, more of a political level that we are now, since the European Parliament is now actually working very much on the European Commission proposal on this very important piece of legislation to allow the online services providers to continue to make use of those technological tools to detect child sexual abuse material, even after the entering into force of the European Electronic Code in December 2020, which will have the unintended consequences to prevent then this online services provider from continuing to use these technological solutions or tools to actually detect child sexual abuse material. It is very important to mention that in this political debate, the eternal debate between privacy versus security, or in purely legally terms, when it comes to criminal law, the eternal debate between repressive measures versus preventive measures, I think in this context might be misleading, because in fact, the two things have to go hand in hand and can go together. I do think that, in fact, the repressive measures alone, as it has been clearly said by Signe before me, cannot be the only answer, because of course, they always intervene after the crime is consumed. So after, when already the harm has been done. So that is why I want to really very much commend the efforts of the European Union, and especially the European Commission, that has published recently an EU strategy for a more effective fight against child sexual abuse, where it has included clear provisions for the European Union member states to invest more in preventive measures. So now the European Parliament is called on finding a legally sound solution to this unintended consequence of the European Electronic Communication Code. And I'm very confident, because I've witnessed it firsthand, given the lot of importance that has been attached by the politicians, that an agreement within the Parliament is within reach. So then over to you now.
Thank you so much, Emilio, and thank you for giving us a little bit more background to the really, I think, central issue that is being discussed in Europe now, especially given that, as Signe was saying, the predators don't care where the material is hosted. They don't care where it's sitting. They just want access to it. And we know that a lot of material that is being processed is actually hosted in Europe. And if this legislation is disabling us from using the existing tools, both from industry, but also from the NGO side, I think it's going to be really detrimental have detrimental impacts on children and our ability to protect them online. I think the entire discussion keeps on coming back, which I'm really happy about, back to the centering on the children and the survivors. And I, Biban, want to go to you now and really ask you a question that really is kind of like at the center of how you do your work. So you at Five Rights Foundation are really centering on the child, and how different factors in digital environments and policy spaces create this risk environment or safety environment around children. And here you're looking into like broader ecosystems. So you're looking into design features and business model of digital platforms, policy and regulatory frameworks, and so on. And most recently, you have been generating a lot of attention around your work around risky by design, as well as efforts to create a global guidance and tools for development of child online protection policy frameworks. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you're seeing, how these design features are actually promoting a culture either of safety or risk, and how can we find a way to work with key stakeholders to create frameworks where we can actually address these issues? Over to you, Biban.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say what an incredible privilege it is to come after two speakers with whom there's a breakout of agreement here from me about what they both said, and they put the case very well. And I thought I might just briefly touch on two narratives that I find very difficult, because part of this and part of the subtext of or indeed even the text of what the previous speaker said, is about changing the narrative about how we talk about it, and then also perhaps talk about a couple of things we're doing at Five Rights. So the first piece is really the idea that it is okay to suggest that child sexual abuse is an acceptable part of a company balance sheet, right? So I'm forever being told that, you know, it will be, if we deal with it, it'd be restrictive to growth, or, you know, or as one tech executive said to me recently, on the one hand, on the other hand, and I asked him to put both hands on the table, because I said, on the one hand, on the other hand, is not an acceptable framing. You know, it's not about a network effect versus children's. It's not about, you know, content creators' need for income on the one hand, and on the other hand, children's needs, etc., etc., etc. So I think we have to stop treating it like a balance sheet and ask a more fundamental question, which is to say, if you can't run a company without spreading industrial levels of CSAM, are you fit to trade? Right? And I think if we answer that question honestly, it would drive investment into tackling CSAM out of the system much, much quicker than any of the conversations that we're currently having, including the current binary between privacy and protection, which I agree with Emilio is both unhelpful, untrue, and just simply not the right place to be. And yet we're constantly fought into a corner that actually puts friends as foes in the policy arena. And I consider myself a child protection activist and a privacy activist. So that's where I sit, and that's where we all need to sit, because the technological systems that are being built for the future right now, the ones that regulators haven't even got their eyes on yet, are being designed without the explicit needs of children. Yeah. So and so I think that we have to remember that a lot of this is happening in the arena of private companies, and as Signe said about terms and conditions, you know, that actually we need more than two people in this debate. It's not about companies and users, it's about nation states, it's about the international community, it's about regulators, it's about all of those people as one part of a tripartite thing between users, companies, and what we might call society in a broad sense. So that's one really important narrative that I feel that all of us, and sometimes myself included, have got wrong, and we have to be much, much more disciplined about the way we talk about this. I think the other thing, and this is very particularly, you know, a function of Five Rights Foundation and my colleagues and the team we have, which is that there is a tendency, it's driven by our own sense of horror, it's driven by the media, it's also driven by the politicians, but to concentrate on the extreme. But we fail to look carefully enough at the culture that's feeding them, or at least we excuse that culture very quickly. So for example, we know that a diet of hardcore pornography straight into the hands of primary age children desensitizes them, meaning that they need ever more extreme sexual content to be excited. We know that it's ruined the concept of consent, where young girls present in their hundreds and thousands with eye infections and anal tears that are a direct result of acting out pornographic scenarios, often unwanted and unconsensual. Or the normalization of sharing and sexual content, for example, the UK company OnlyFans, which in turn makes self-generated sexual abuse material the fastest growing area of concern. So, you know, we have these drivers that we appear to accept in the commercial world as absolutely normal, and we're not really looking at it properly. And it creates a very toxic environment for children and fuels a very distorted sexual and relationship environment, which, among other things, creates a growing market for CSAM. And what I find astonishing is that it's done in plain sight of all of us. Yeah. And whilst we will always have a battle against a group of bad actors, we really cannot afford private companies to profit from sharing, spreading, and selling sexual content to and of our kids. Yeah. And I just put this in the mind of people, you know, it's like, imagine if there was a local cafe somewhere on a high street with 8, 10, 12, or even 16-year-olds in the window selling, you know, images of themselves, videos of themselves, you know, in reality. And this narrative that it's somehow normalized in the digital world, you know, is really, really problematic for dealing what is really, you know, atrocious at the sharp end, because it drives a culture. So those are my two sort of concerns around the narrative and about how people like us may perhaps, and I really did hear very, very, you know, it was resounded in my imagination, both of the previous speakers saying we must put the light on it, but we must also start talking about it in a realistic way. Do you know this is happening? Would you accept it in real life? You know, can you see this comparison? And try and talk about it in languages that is perhaps not so expert, but is evocative of something that they would find completely unacceptable in so-called real life, although we all know this is indeed real life. So let me turn very briefly to two things that we're doing at Five Rights. First, my colleague Victoria has been working on Risky by Design, and I will, in the course of this session, put a link in the chat for everyone. But what it does is it highlights the everyday risks and common features of the digital world. For example, you know, introducing strange adults to children, or exposing children's real-time location to strangers, or the problems of public streaming from bedrooms, and then introducing private messaging into that environment. And what it really looks at is the cumulative nature of that risk. So if you make a child public to 500 million viewers on TikTok and then have direct messaging, which thankfully they just got rid of, but there are other services that do that, you are in effect putting them in the window that I alluded to earlier. Yeah, and so on. And what Risky by Design does is it shows people who are not thinking about the system, who are only thinking about the content, that actually there's so much we could do by child risk assessment, by actually upholding a really basic set of design principles that have more to do with health and safety kind of legislation than any of the legislation that we're currently talking about, myself included. And then finally, I just want to do a bit of a shout out, because I think everyone on this call may in fact be our friend to this project, which is with the end violence community around the world. We are creating a global child online protection handbook. And this actually came out of previous work where we wrote a child online protection policy for the government of Rwanda. And so many countries reached out to us and said, you know, we would really like your help in this. And the idea that many of the frameworks that we all work to, the MNR, the convention and so on, are not quite practical enough if you are the person in a country who is actually given the job of actually writing the roadmap. So what it is very holistic, it has very broad pillars, but it actually seeks to identify steps, pathways and best practice. And those are just two of our flagship projects. But I think fundamentally, you know, what I'd like to say is we must insist that society does not duck the big questions. The biggest of which is, has the digital world delivered for children? And the resounding answer is no. And we have to start from that perspective, not deal with the harm after the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biban, and thank you so much for so graphically and passionately explaining the key issues, I think, that are surrounding children in this complex environment that we are grappling with, and not to mention how they feel in the whole complexity. I will now move from that level because you've set the stage perfectly for John, I think. And John, through the work of IGM in the Philippines, you're doing some impressive work to support and build capacity of the justice system to effectively tackle online child sexual exploitation and abuse. And then, but you're not only working with the justice system, you are through this working seeing the firsthand how the interplay between local capacities, normative frameworks, business model of companies, and then access to adequate technologies can either foster or hamper the response and prevention efforts and action to address child abuse. Can you tell us a bit more about what you have learned over the years and how we can draw from those lessons and use it more broadly beyond the Philippines? Like, so what have been the main learnings and how they relate also to some of the things that the other panelists have brought up today? Over to you, John.
Thanks so much, Maria. Thank you for hosting this, and really just so happy to be part of this panel and hear from all the experts. I just want to say I agree with everything that's been said so far, and it's just great that we have different perspectives from different kinds of work that we've been doing. I think I would just say IJM has been primarily working in the global South, and so a lot of what I'm going to share is really from that perspective, and where victims are routinely abused to create child sexual abuse material, videos, photos, live streaming, and yet the justice system is just not at the capacity that we often take for granted in the more developed world. And so I would just say IGM has been operating in 13 different countries, and over the last 23 years we've learned a lot. So what we've been doing is working alongside governments in the developing world to strengthen the basic infrastructure and capacity of justice systems to protect the most vulnerable people from violence. And we've been doing that in the Philippines since 2001, and since 2011, focused on the online sexual exploitation of children. But what I will say is we see the same thing in country after country. When you strengthen the capacity of frontline government agencies in a sustainable way, then they can better implement and enforce the law to identify victims, to rescue them from ongoing harm, and to hold offenders accountable. And I think that's really important, not only for the justice system, but for the larger society and the community. Because when you have a state of impunity where children are being sold online, where they're being trafficked, where they're being abused, and it's sort of an open secret, and it's a way that people make money, then what that communicates is this is okay. our society, our government thinks this is acceptable. And so you actually have to replace that environment of impunity with just a measure of accountability, where some people are going and being arrested and being prosecuted, where victims are actually being identified and rescued. And so what IGM has learned is what's really critical is to enter into partnerships with specialized police, prosecutors, social service providers on the ground, and actually take cases through the justice system pipeline to identify what are the gaps in this justice system and what are some potential solutions to things like victim identification, to case buildup, to police, applying for and getting search warrants. Again, it's the things that we take for granted in other countries, but in the global South, these are just some simple things that just often don't work, right? And so what we've learned is when you work with governments to implement those solutions, you can actually see amazing results in terms of victim identification, victim safeguarding, offenders held accountable, crime prevalence reduction, and overall improved justice system performance. And I just want to highlight 4 things I think that are just so basic that IGM has learned in country after country, and that now we're seeking to scale into new countries that we're not working in, and really want to scale through local NGOs, local partners. The first is that you need a clear government mandate to investigate and combat the crime, whatever it is. It could be live streaming of sexual abuse, it could be a trafficking of children, but you need a government mandate that tells specific specialized law enforcement units, prosecutors, that, hey, it is within your remit, it is within your job to investigate these cases, to prosecute these cases, to provide social services and aftercare to these survivors. And oftentimes that mandate just doesn't exist. Or if it exists, it's just sort of cascaded to all law enforcement, right? But it doesn't work that way, because all law enforcement are dealing with all crimes. You really need a specialized law enforcement unit with expertise, training, and time to work on these cases. I think the other thing we've learned is that these units do need sufficient government resources. So you could introduce excellent technology that's working in the developed world, but what you need first is for those units who are going to use that technology to have staffing. Enough staff to use it, right? With recurrent annual funding for their budget and basic equipment, laptops, good internet, office space. Then when you introduce, new technology, it's actually going to be used. The trick is if you just bring the technology, it's just going to sit on the shelf and collect dust. If the people aren't trained, if they don't have the resources and the mandate to use it. And then finally, I think what you have to do is always contextualize the response. So what we've learned at IJM is, for example, law enforcement and prosecutors, they don't need a one-size-fits-all like seminar training. This is what works in the US or in Australia, so do it in the Philippines. That doesn't work, because the training has to be contextualized to the local legal framework. What actually are the police allowed to do here? What are they not allowed to do? And what technology is allowed under the law? What is not allowed? And so contextualized training is really critical to strengthen the justice system. And so I think when you talk about all of these things, what's really critical is that when you're talking about technology, you're talking about training, even when you're talking about balancing privacy and child protection, what's critical is that governments really have a clear-eyed understanding of what's happening on the ground in their country, in their region, globally. I mean, we've all sort of said this in different ways, but the sexual exploitation of children online is a global crime, right? And so it doesn't work to just have a jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach. What children need is for the global community to come together and say, this is the standard across the board. This is the material that has to get removed. This is, the data sharing that needs to happen between, technology companies and law enforcement. For example, law enforcement in the Philippines, can't can't get the kind of evidence or data that law enforcement in the US can get from US technology companies, right? They can't serve a search warrant on them. They have to go through a drawn out, process of MLAT and other things like that. And it just doesn't work. So I think what's really important is, the governments really ensure that their legal framework is actually empowering the justice system and private industry to do what's necessary to combat these crimes. And then, of course, at the same time, as Signe mentioned, we actually do need private industry to step up their game and say, okay, we're not going to do the bare minimum that's required under the law, but we're actually going to do the most that we can that's allowed under law, right? And then as Emilio pointed out, even that's getting tricky with the EU, right? But I think we have to be speaking as one voice to governments and to industry that, look, this is a pandemic. The sexual abuse of children online, in person, to create online materials is a pandemic, and we should be responding to it the same way we have with this global pandemic. I mean, look, governments are shutting down countries, right? I mean, nothing is getting shut down to protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. What that says is we haven't taken it seriously enough. Governments have not taken it seriously enough. And also industry to some extent hasn't taken it seriously enough either. So I think that's what IGM has learned, from just being on the ground. All these things are important, but in the global South, don't forget, like step 1, step 2, step 3, strengthen the core infrastructure of the justice system first.
Thank you so much, John. And I think most of what you've said actually really strongly resonates with the work that we are doing with the Five Rights Foundation to really enable more proactive and action-oriented frameworks for the governments to create, not only focusing on a specific illegal aspect of CSAM, but what does a child online safety and protection nurturing framework at the country level look like to empower all the sectors to do what they need to do to prevent the risks, but also address the harms. And I think that's really, really important to emphasize. I don't see any questions in the Q&A chat box. I'll just continue talking to my panelists because I love doing that. I'm gonna go back to Signe for a moment, and I don't want us to be, the message has been so far, I think, sobering for most of the people on the call. I want us to be a little bit more kind of optimistic as well. And Signe, you have been telling us how over the last few years you started working more proactively with some of the ISPs, internet service providers, and they have become more kind of open to hear you and learn from you and work with you over the years to become more proactive in removing this material. Tell us what was the trick, if you will. How did you get them to become more of a, let's say, positive players in this ecosystem? Oh, mute.
Well, that's a loaded question. If I can be completely frank, the New York Times articles. You start to expose the rot. Then companies start to become a little bit nervous about how the public feels about what companies are choosing to leave up and what they're taking down. And often it was just the worst of the worst. So we've certainly been on a journey with those companies who are prepared to be talking to us, and there are many of them certainly, to educate them on what this issue really means. So when you're getting a notice related to, it's a CSAM adjacent image, so the four corners might not meet the threshold for something illegal, but it's incredibly destructive and harmful to that victim because they're a known survivor. That needs to be removed, and there should be no question about keeping that up. And it's really odd sometimes, the arguments that will come back. Does the survivor really want this material removed? It's just so out of touch with reality, and certainly not in step with what's happening for survivors. So we've absolutely seen, and we're more than prepared to give credit where credit is due. But at the same time, I do not feel sorry for industry. They are making billions of dollars. I feel sorry for children. And we will always land on the side of children and how we are not doing enough for them. And just so that I can actually talk about a little bit about prevention quickly, I think it's really interesting. You know, we've bought into this narrative that it's parents' responsibility to keep children safe online. And companies and industry has fed into that notion, which is quite frankly insane. The idea that parents can manage and know everything their kids are doing online is absolutely impossible. So while we do need to educate children about being safe online and being responsible digital citizens, we need to be creating platforms that actually are established with children in mind. Otherwise, don't have kids on your platform. If you have adult pornography on your platform and you have children intersecting with it, you're going to end up with problems. Bevan mentioned OnlyFans. The companies are, you know, you've got Twitter as an example, where they're the gateway, they're the advertiser for OnlyFans and leading teens over to that environment where then they're deciding that, oh, I'll monetize my sexual material. And it is creating an absolute disaster online. So I really think that it's of course essential that prevention, we're focusing on the wrong side of the coin. Quite frankly, we've got all of this harm occurring online, and then governments are actually in a position where taxpayers' dollars are going towards ramping up law enforcement efforts, looking at more Crown prosecutors. We're stacking it on the wrong side. We need a framework that, of course, has civil society in mind, but a framework that holds companies accountable for the systems that they create and they are profiting from. And they are profiting to the tune of billions of dollars. So, you know, we're seeing a shift, and it's important, and we will continue on that journey. But I really, to be quite frank and honest, the reason you know, companies are starting to care what we think about it is because they're determining that we've actually got big mouths, and we're prepared to say that where there are problems.
Thank you, Signe. I think Emilia wants to build on what you've just said, and I think it resonates with the European Union's current developments. Over to you, Emilia. But very quickly, because we also have now a lot of questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Maria. No, I just wanted to say precisely on this, picking up on what just Signe left us with in prevention. Unfortunately, in my experience, having been worked for 5 years already in the European Parliament, and with politicians, I must say that it's more difficult for politicians to understand that it's more important to invest in prevention. Because, you know, prevention, you don't see the fruit of your investment immediately, right? You see that actually just afterwards. So it is also something that is very difficult for politicians to also say them back home to their electors. It gives much more strength to say, hey, we invested so much, we increased the number of police officers out there. Even like visually gives more sense of security that you put more police officers out there. So unfortunately, like also in the legislative perspective, it's much more difficult to make people understand that it's more important to, in fact, invest in prevention. But I have to say, and this I conclude, of course, that is recently in the European Commission strategy for a most effective fight against sexual abuse, also after multiple calls from the European Parliament, at least at EU level, that has been understood and now it's more widely shared. So more is going to come and happen in prevention and preventive measures. And the European Commission will actually set up soon a preventive network. So yeah, I just wanted to end with this positive note.
Thank you so much, Emilia. So we have now a question for and I'm just going to ask you to see who wants to come in from one of our colleagues, and it says, how can design for safety become part of industry culture? And I think that's $1 billion question, but does anybody want to particularly address it? Maybe Biban, you, and then maybe you can take the question that was asked to you also around the culture of, you know, balancing different aspects around sexuality of young people below 18 and above 18. Over to you, Biban, maybe.
Okay. I'm going to start with the first question, if you don't mind, just because.
Okay, go ahead.
So I've been asked this question about, on the one hand, on the other hand, and I've also been told that I am against even 18 plus pornography. And I just put on the record, I'm not against 18 plus pornography as a political stance. I personally don't use 18 plus pornography, and I have some issues around misogyny and consent. But in the context of this, this conversation, I want to be clear that I am talking about the routine delivery of 18 plus pornography into the hands of children. And in the UK, at least, the average age upon which a child first sees hardcore pornography is now 8. So I'm actually talking about a child whose sexuality may be very different and blossoming, but for at any age. But I am absolutely sure that it's not a great idea that the first idea of your own sexuality, or indeed other people's sexuality, is a gangbang into the school playground by your phone unasked for. So I really want to make that very strongly, Now, on your other point, I would absolutely say, slightly guilty as charged, because I do believe in balancing rights. And I think what I was trying to say, and maybe I should have been more careful and say, I do not understand this balancing between child sexual abuse and the commercial benefits of companies, rather than balancing overall. So the balance sheet of benefit from a corporate perspective was what I was saying. And thank you for that comment, because I will say it more carefully next time. And then I do also want to just pick up on one thing, which actually speaks to both of the questions I was just asked, which is around recommend loops. Yeah, about automated systems. If I actually say something ghastly, terrible, even the worst in my own room here in London, and it is accessible only to those people that I can tell about it in a personal way, yeah, that is very much more limited than actually the way things are spread in ways that are deliberate and automated. And I think that we have to look, and I'm not talking about rings of pedophiles here, I'm just talking about the sorts of spread of material that I was talking about in the more broader part of the conversation, that actually this stuff is spread super dry. And I think that that is one of the places where regulation has to now start looking, because it is different to say that anybody can say and do what they like within the law than it is to say that you have an absolute right to spread that all over the world, irrespective of the societal or individual damage, or indeed the age of the person who receives it. And then finally, if I might say that actually, educating children to deal with a toxic world that is built on the commercial interests of a handful of people is not an adequate response. Absolutely, we must educate kids. And actually, one of the things that I do with my spare time, not that I have much, is data literacy for children. Yeah, and that's a very different thing from e-safety. That's a very different thing from digital literacy. But data literacy really helps them understand how they are being nudged and pushed by the information around them, including their own actions, and makes them feel actually both angry and strong, I would say. But we cannot let the final answer be that we educate children for a bad environment instead of clean up the environment.
Thank you so much, Biban, and I don't think that anybody could agree more with what you've just said. John, I think do you want to chip in, because I see you putting.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add one thing to the prevention conversation, because I think I don't want us to miss the fact that there are different forms of prevention. There's sort of going upstream and understanding what are the causes or factors that lead to offending. But I think also what IGM has learned in our experience is that if you take a situation where you have complete impunity and no one is ever held accountable for abusing children, and you replace that with some measure of accountability, then you actually do create a deterrence, and that deterrence is itself a form of prevention. So for example, in several of our projects in the Philippines, in Cambodia, we've seen significant reductions of the prevalence of child sex trafficking, in-person child sex trafficking, in bars and brothels and street red light districts, because you had justice systems that were stood up, and all of a sudden were a situation where traffickers were never arrested or prosecuted. Now they were being arrested or prosecuted by the dozens or the hundreds. And so I think, obviously, justice system response and deterrence is not the entirety of prevention. There are so many other ways that you guys are discussing, and I couldn't agree more. But I think we don't want to lose sight of that, especially in the global South, where you do have pockets where there's just complete impunity. And so if you're not afraid that you're ever going to get caught for selling, and for producing and selling child sexual abuse material, I'm going to tell you what, that's the number one reason that people will do it, is because they're not afraid of getting caught. And so I think we have to just, never forget that strengthening a justice system to create a deterrence is actually part of prevention. I think we just take it for granted, around the world, because we have, justice systems that more or less are functioning at some, effective level. I think the other thing I just want to comment in terms of prevention is actually this idea of, child sexual abuse materials getting online in the first instance, right? Which I think, to me, is actually ridiculous. I think every tech platform should choose to use photo DNA and other tools to detect and block CSAM at the upload. Because if you think about it, it's contraband, it's illegal. It's not a matter of freedom of expression. Nobody has a right to possess that material in the first place, let alone, introduce it into, a platform where there are children and other people. I mean, just imagine if, with other contraband like guns, if you're not allowed to bring a gun into an airport or into a mall, where do they check for that gun? When you're walking in, there's a metal detector. And so I think photo DNA and other, AI tools should be like metal detectors. They should be when you're stepping into the platform, if you're carrying contraband, block. You can't bring that in because it's illegal. And so nobody has a privacy interest to possess child sexual abuse materials, let alone to upload them. So I think we have to have a higher standard for this idea of preventing CSAM, not just taking it down once it's on, but it shouldn't get up there in the first place.
Thank you so much, John. I think we have left a couple of more minutes, and I do want to kind of summarize the key points you made, but I also want to give you a 30-second chance to kind of like make one final point for the audience. Given that there have been some questions around safety by design, questions around the role of users in preventing and thinking about, all the issues that you've mentioned around survivors, impunity, normalization, and so just 30 seconds if you can have a message for the audience. Let's start maybe with Signe again, and then go Emilio, Biban, and then John.
Well, the message is that Arachnid has changed our lens into what's happening for children online. It really is the evidence catcher. So back to John's point about companies blocking, we're seeing companies saying that they're doing it, and then Arachnid, we're finding no one images of child sexual abuse. And then you ask, well, you mustn't be doing it in this area. So there's this inconsistent approach. So at the end of the day, I think what our sense is that we have an epidemic on our hands. We shouldn't be running around patting ourselves on the back thinking we're doing exceptional and extraordinary work. Who has time for that? We really need to be talking about the failures and then how we shift this dialogue and change what is happening for children. And while it would be nice to believe that, there wouldn't be a need for regulation, we believe there is a need for regulation. We need governments to step in. We need governments to lead. We need governments to protect children as they do in the offline world. We would never accept the things that are happening to children in the offline world, but somehow we have turned this environment into all about privacy. And we've completely forgotten the ones that actually have no right to stand forward and say their privacy is being violated every single day. So this has to change.
Thank you. Over to Emilio.
Yeah, thank you. Well, once again, I actually couldn't agree more for what Signe just said. And actually, I just wanted to add, picking up on what John said. I mean, I do agree with him that, of course, the punishment that functions as a deterrent is very important. But at least in Europe, that is not even being an issue because we also have a directive that has made it completely, this is a crime all over Europe, all over the European Union member states. And yet, unfortunately, we're still confronted with a huge number of cases of child sexual abuse. So yeah, I mean, the deterrent is important, but as I said before, I don't think we just have to focus necessarily only on the punitive aspect, it's only on the repressive way. And once again, in the case of prevention, I think something that hasn't been mentioned in this conversation is that I think we should also, especially it's very important for legislators also to take into consideration that unfortunately, as said, and as uncomfortable it might sound, we do know that, you know, some part of our world population has a problem, has a sexual attraction to kids. So it is also important to look into this into like the health perspective, the mental health perspective. So I think this also has to be, you know, has to be tackled as a public health issue. And I think that's where that a lot more needs to be done, focusing on the potential offender. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Emilia. Thank you for raising that really important issue of potential offenders and offenders' work. Biban, over to you, and then John.
Maybe I'll use my 30 seconds to try and answer Esther's question just about parents and so on, just to say, I actually think we underuse consumer law in this area, and that sort of relates to something Signe said right at the beginning. I think we don't use our power as consumers, don't use these companies that don't do the right thing. Yeah, first of all. Secondly, you know, and similarly, I think as citizens, parents, school governors and so on, you know, to fight to put this on the agenda in a sophisticated way, in the way that these panelists are talking about it, with all the tensions that there are in the conversation, but to actually say we need a world in which this is sorted and put it right at the top. And I do agree with what was said earlier. We don't take it seriously enough. I mean, you know, we brought the world to ground for the virus, obviously, but this is also a public health thing. And then really just finally, I spend quite a lot of my time with young people. They are outraged, they are upset, they are anxious. And one of the things they hate the most is standing by and seeing what is happening to their community and to other kids in their environment. And I just kind of go, we owe it to them. You know, we owe it to them. And so I think we have to take a citizen approach and a personal responsibility approach. Until you've done everything in your own world, you haven't done enough, even if you're not an expert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biban, for this call. John, over to you.
Yeah, I think that my last 30 seconds would just be, everything we do has to be survivor centered. Everything we do has to look at it from the perspective of, those individuals who are being harmed right now. And it could be that they're being harmed because there's still a trafficker or offender who's sexually abusing them in person to produce new materials. Or it could be that they're being harmed because they're not in that position anymore, but their abuse materials are still circulating online, and that's an ongoing harm. I think you talk about prioritizing things, right? And I can't think of anything that is more important than protecting those children from further harm. And so whether it's strengthening a justice system that can conduct good investigations, find those victims, and safeguard them, or whether it's ensuring that those materials are removed from the internet as quickly as possible or not uploaded in the first instance, we really have to focus from the survivor perspective, because nobody's experiencing greater harm than survivors. We talk about things like freedom of expression and privacy and resources, but the reality is all of those things can coexist with doing what's in the best interest of survivors. And we do that. We do it all the time. We always balance things, right? I mean, you have freedom of expression, but you can't walk into a theater and yell fire. You have freedom to drive your car, but in most countries, you can't drive at 120 miles an hour because you might kill people. So I think we always balance our freedom with protecting people, right? And there's no reason why we shouldn't do that when it comes to sexual exploitation of children.
Thank you so much, John. We have unfortunately lost people. She had to run, but sending regards to all the and thank you to all the attendees as well. So I just want to really thank you. I have enjoyed this conversation a lot, and I think that we have sort of started by talking about governance and technology, but I love the way we have really kept it centered on the survivors, children, the victims, and the work that needs to happen around there. And I just want to put emphasis on, like, I think the key theme of the panel has been, we need to stop normalizing and accepting that society and companies and users are accepting child sexual abuse as an acceptable level of risk, or acceptable level of for their business model, or acceptable as you know, like a balance between issues around privacy and safety, because that is not helpful. And I think going back to speaking about the issues of like what can happen, and I love the way that Signe was saying what helped them kind of advance a little bit their work was New York Times articles. Let's speak more about the issue and find the ways for the people, societies, users, and communities to use their power and pressure to make the change within societies, companies, and governments. So I think that would be kind of like the call that we as End Violence have to our partners, but also everybody on this panel and beyond. I want to thank everybody for being here today. I want to say that this event was also part of the End Violence Summit series, which are aimed at inspiring and catalyzing political and financial commitments needed to end violence against children. So I think your calls are really aligned to that. As we enter the decade of action to deliver sustainable development goals, the global campaign that we are launching will really support acceleration of action, especially given the context of COVID-19 and beyond. So thank you everybody once more. And I hope that the attendees have had a chance to learn something and engage. Please be in touch with us, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
Bye. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.